Welcome to another edition of I Am Thomas. And I Am Thomas. We're going to, we're actually in Calvary Cemetery, one of my favorite cemeteries to vlog here. Located in Woodside, New York. And we're visiting the grave, and we're telling the story of a individual who's very popular, a folk figure, for lack of a better word, but a very interesting story. Now, just as a side note, if you're familiar looking down this road here, this is actually too where a famous scene from The Godfather was portrayed, but that is in a prior video that I have done before, so you can look up on the channel that video. But this is a very famous cemetery. It has a lot of cool individuals in their history and American culture, and we're visiting the grave today of Mr. Brodie, Steve Brodie. And Steve Brodie passed away at a very early age of 39. But he made an impact, and made himself a lot of money at the same time. Before we get into all of that, Mr. Brodie is buried in Section 9 of the cemetery. So this cemetery has 4 parts to it. He's buried in in the first part of Calvary Cemetery, Section 9. And there is a picture of Mr. Steve Brodie. You know, when I heard of the tale of Steve Brodie, I thought to myself, you know, I could see where this controversy comes up about him, which we'll discuss. It's either, is he a bit of a jerk? Is he an entrepreneur? Is she misunderstood? A lot of questions come into play, and I think all of them are true. All of them have some weight, which has probably led to him being so successful. And this is the grave of Steve Brodie. Steve Brodie was born in 1861 in the Bowery section of New York City in Manhattan, Lower Manhattan. And when he was born, just 3 days after that, his father was killed. So from the start, you know, you kind of get the idea of the neighborhood that he grew up in. As he was growing up, when I say growing up, around 5 or 6, he became part of the gang called the Bowery Gang, Bowery Boys. You know, these individuals were anti-Catholic, anti-Irish. It was more of a criminal gang. They were up to mischief. And, you know, the Bowery Boys just menaced their neighborhood. They were a menace. Now, Brodie was the youngest of 7 children. Instead of attending school, Steve worked as a child selling newspapers starting at the age of 6. Now, his older brothers would constantly beat him. They took his hard-earned money, and because of that, he moved out of his home and moved into a boys' home, and later went on to live in a newsboy lodging house. Now, here in the city, in the part of the city's history, when you are a newsboy, which is what he became at such an early age, when you were a newsboy, you simply explained, the best way to explain it is you had to sell newspapers every day, or else you risked becoming homeless. You fought for street corners and fought to protect your property. Often men, they robbed the boys, and older boys robbed the younger boys. In his late teens, he led his own gang of newsboys. He won the friendship of people he came in contact with. He became acquainted with many people different classes, brokers, capitalists, lawyers, newspapermen, athletes, sporting men, actors, cranks, crooks, bums, and all different walks of life to help him survive. Because if he didn't sell those newspapers, he missed out on possibly losing his home where he lived. And this is a photo of the Brooklyn Bridge, and that will also play a part in the story, which we'll soon get to. Very famous, him in the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, Steve Brodie was, in his early life here in New York, he was big into the sport called pedestrianism. Say that 5 times backwards. What that means is basically, you guessed it, walking. Now, this is in a gymnasium of the Newsboys Lounging House down there on Chambers Street. Brodie was, 5 feet 7 inches, weighed 125 pounds, and he was good in walking. He walked 90 miles in 24 hours, and to my understanding, this was a big sport back then. People would watch all this happen in the gymnasium. 24 hours walking around in the gymnasium, and he did 90 miles. Things people do to keep himself occupied back in the day, correct? So that was a pretty good, he was pretty good at it. And he gained notoriety. But a lot of people that were in this sport back then, they kind of were just not your average people that were in this sport. These people in this sport were just usually crooks and criminals, and they usually were in the sport just to gain notoriety. They wanted their fame, the 15 minutes of fame. But Brodie's career would kind of unravel here. He was a bad boy of the sport, right? He was vulgar at times. When spectators would trash talk to him, he would mouth off. He would answer back. He wouldn't take no crap. He had various run-ins with the law. And, but at the same time, he was doing, 1-day races to 6-day races. There was a time when in the sport that he was in where he was going up against horses, and he was just a big name. The best way to put it, to summarize it, it came crashing down because, of his attitudes and various run-ins. His career ended when his winnings would equate to about $175,000. It was $6,000 back then. And all those fortunes that he had after he left the sport, Brodie kind of lost it in gambling on horses. He was married after he left the career of ultra running, and he settled down, but again, everything that he had, he lost. And he's now soon had to take on a job as a street conductor. So when he left the sport, it was around 1880. And now, we fast forward to 1882, he's back in the public eye again. He makes news where he saves a bunch of people. A building caught fire, and Brodie saved several lives by climbing a telegraph pole and throwing a rope to people on the upper stories of the building. Awarded a gold medal Love the fame, reward, and attention. Yes, you see that article. Brooklyn Bridge. That's Steve Brodie. He jumps from a Brooklyn Bridge. Or did he? We fast forward to 1883. And Brodie, again, a couple of bad things, does a good thing, and now is bad again as he, back in court, fined $300 for assaulting his brother. And then in 1886, the two brothers got in a fight again, arrested, taken before the court. Then a few months later, he was shot. So just a constant run-ins with the law, fines being paid, lost all his fortune already, just on a slippery slope is Mr. Brodie, just constantly on this slope. So now, back to the Brooklyn Bridge. It is now the year of 1883. The Brooklyn Bridge, the many, many years of work is finally done. And Steve Brodie, living in New York, he had witnessed the completion of the bridge. And an idea came to him as to how he could use that bridge to bring back his fame and his fortune. Remember, run-ins with the law, gambling, he's lost everything that he did in ultra running or pedestrianism. Lost all that fortune, so he needed to get his fame back. Now, individual by the name of Robert Odlum, he was a swimming instructor and a daredevil, and he announced that he could make a leap off the Brooklyn Bridge on that given day. The police tried to stop the stunt, but he managed to get across the bridge in a secret, in secret did he go, and he made his leap into the East River. That was 135 feet below. He hit the water awkwardly and came up bleeding internally. Critical injuries. He was hauled into a boat, but he died very quickly from his injuries. So now, Steve Brodie, a few months later, he got the idea that he could make that jump successfully. Wagers were made. Bookies everywhere were odds. Odds makers were betting on this event. He put together his plan, did Steve Brodie. For 2 weeks, he had the big bridge in his head, and he planned to make the jump. He had planned to make that jump even if it would cost him his life. He first practiced jumping off a high bridge into the Harlem River. He even informed all the sports editors of his intention. July 23, 1886, he met with reporters to let them take pictures, ask questions. He then went with friends in a wagon to the bridge. When the wagon had gone past the large granite bridge tower, it was said that he slipped some of his jacket, flung it into the face of his companions, and leapt into the roadway. Climbing hand over hand down the outside iron railing, like a monkey, he clambered down to the bottom of the iron structure. He then reached the bottom, and he took hold of one of the truss cables under the bridge. He swung by both hands free into the air. The boat containing his friends was in the middle of the river. A shriek went up from somebody to the dock, on the dock below. Then Brodie let go. He fell for 3 seconds, feet first, and disappeared into the water in a fountain of spray. The boat arrived as Brodie appeared on the surface. He made a feeble signal for assistance and then began to swim toward the boat. He was taken ashore in a boat, drank 2 glasses of whiskey, offered to dance a hornpipe, and threatened to trash a policeman. He was locked up in the Oak Street station, arraigned in a police court while very drunk, and he would be spending the night in a cell. He was charged with attempted suicide, because this is apparently what the policeman thought. Someone jumping off the Brooklyn Bridge is surely crazy. Held for a physical and psychiatric examination. When his body was examined, when he was given that physical, there were no significant bruises on his body. There was only a scrape from being brought into the boat. And now he boasted that he could jump off anything from the earth. Now, was the leap a hoax? Remember, Mr. Brodie, not the best of reputations from his prior career. He's now broke. Pretty much didn't have any money. Various run-ins. So his history was lies and deception. The newspapers, though, here in the city, they mostly believed the story and made Brodie the most famous person in America that year. Others, though, claimed that Brodie had a friend toss a dummy off the bridge while he hid under a nearby pier, then swam out when the rescue boat approached. There was the express belief that the jump was a hoax. That's what Dave McCullough wrote in his book. It was said of Brodie, ever since he laid down his tights in Madison Square Garden and listened to the waves of applause washing against the four walls, Brodie has been famishing for notoriety. His principal occupation consisted of lounging about the street. He traveled around various cities for a time doing stunts and telling his story in dime museums until those opportunities dried up. Nonetheless, in 1887, Brodie took advantage of his notoriety. He opened up a saloon in the Barry district with the museum about his jump. Now he was no longer the newsboy. He was now Steve Brodie, the bridge jumper. Hanging above the bar was a massive oil painting showing Brodie making his famous jump from the Brooklyn Bridge into the waters of the East River. Next to it, a paper signed by a boat captain swearing that he was the one who dragged Brodie from the river after the defied death. Now, in 1889, Brodie claimed that he had gone over Niagara Falls in a rubber suit. He produced a 1,500-word version of his story that was printed in the New York Sun, but reporters finally became skeptical and realized that only 3 New York men were the ones who claimed to see him go over the falls. They were Brodie's hand-picked witnesses. It was written, "This faking business has ceased to be amusing." People who were on the Maid of Mist gave a different story, seeing men hiding in a bush, faking the entire thing, putting a man into a wagon in a blanket. Finally, someone from the Buffalo Evening News, they pointed out that the entire detailed story, it came from a prior individual who had a reputation of reporting outlandish stories to sell newspapers. In the past, newspapers had printed stories that came directly from Brodie and assumed the daring accomplishments were true. His stories had been corroborated again and again by his own hired men who were with him in the dark and misty hours of the morning. He, being called out in Brodie, eventually admitted that Niagara Falls, well, yeah, that was a complete fraud. Well, and even though he did admit it was a complete fraud, he did get people talking about him yet again, meaning more money coming into his bank account. Or did they have bank accounts back then? I think they did. Right, and the public was talking about him yet again. Why not take advantage? Fresh on everyone's memory, and he began a career on stage, and kind of played throughout the country for many years in a melodrama type of deal called In the Bowery, where he put his whole purpose in the presentation on stage was to depict certain scenes from his life. He did clean up his reputation there for a time. He gave money to charities and kind of was he helped a lot of unfortunate, people that had unfortunate luck, unfortunate situations in the slums of New York, and he helped them out. But, kind of the legal troubles, lawsuits relating to outstanding debts from his theater tours still kind of followed him around. So he was never able to get that away. 1900, he moved to Buffalo, where he opened up a saloon concert hall there, kind of trying to re-spark some of that Niagara Falls fame that he had earlier, even though, he did say it was all just a clever ruse. And he was there, living there in Buffalo, and his name was in the news nearly every day. His family life, though, had become a mess. He divorced, remarried, and his son, Steve Brodie Jr., left home during his teens after fighting with his father. June of 1900, Steve Brodie's health began to fail. He sold everything in Buffalo, then went back to New York for the Bowery and the Bowery neighborhood there, but he became hospitalized. Tried to get his health in order, moved to San Antonio where the weather was warm, but he was trying to recover and, greatly emaciated. He was speaking in a whisper. He was, losing his life very quickly. In 1901, Steve Brodie passed away, age of 39. It is believed that he accumulated, at that time, a fortune of $85,000. In today's money, roughly, that's about $2.9 million. Now, was Brodie a fraud? He, for sure, for a brief period of time there, was a accomplished ultra runner. But one might believe that his fame and fortune kind of drove him to find easier ways to kind of feed his ego and accumulate wealth. Once you had that 15 minutes of fame, he kept on wanting it. And he might have been a smart man. Whether it be positive press, bad press, he was always in the news and almost like a entrepreneur. Remember, if you're out of sight, you're out of mind. Now, was the leap true fraud or truth or fraud? No one will ever know except Mr. Brodie.